Hello and welcome to Docaviv 2021 at the Cinematheque around Tel Aviv and online. My name is Ohad Landesman and I'm thrilled to be here with Alan Berliner, director of Letter to the Editor, which is screening in our master's program. Letter to the Editor is available online until the end of the day, actually, July 10th, which is also the end of the festival, unfortunately, on the Docaviv website. And now only a few words in Hebrew and we'll switch back to English. שלום וברוכים הבאים לדוקאביב 2021 בסינמטק ברחבי תל אביב ואונליין. אני אוהד לנדסמן ואני מתרגש מאוד להיות כאן עם אלן ברלינר, הבמאי של מכתב לעורך, שמוקרן בפסטיבל במסגרת תוכנית מאסטרים, והוא זמין לצפייה עד סוף היום, 10 ביולי, באתר דוקאביב. So, hi Alan, it's such a big pleasure to have you here and to finally speak with you after so many years that I've been watching your films and teaching them and thinking about them. And I want to first ask you, where are you now? We were looking at this room in the background, we see all these drawers that connect to things that we probably going to speak about.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that thanks to Docaviv for showing my film. And thank you for this opportunity to talk about the film. And thank you, Ohad, for allowing me to have this conversation with you. I'm honored to be here. So, and welcome to everyone in Zoom land, in the universe, who's here with us watching. I'm in a basement space where I've created a kind of workshop for myself. In addition to films, I do installation projects and sculptural things. And I've spent the last year and a half now almost during the pandemic in a kind of isolation, in isolation and in seclusion, working on a new body of sculptural projects. I call it Think Like a Filmmaker. And it's my attempt to bring cinematic concepts and ideas and my love for the art and the materials of motion picture film, which is how I learned how to tell stories, to create a new way of looking at things, looking at film, and to energize these old objects. They're now antiques. You know, you can film reels of film and film itself. They're now thought of as antiques, mid-century antiques. And so this is the workshop where I've been basically for the last year and a half working on these things. So I'm in a non-filmic place in my process, in my life.
So the drawers are probably the archive of the elements that are going to be part of your sculptural.
Exactly. And there are many, many more drawers and grids of drawers surrounding me. This is just one wall. So yes, this is an archive. This is another kind of archive. I have filmic archives, I have sound archives, but I have an enormous archive of objects. Many of them from media. You know, I take things apart and I put them back together, which it's all connected. I do the same thing with film, you know, with images and sounds. So it's the same thing.
So we'll get back to drawers in a bit. I want to tell you that your conversation is probably one of the last events in the festival, and it's kind of bookending the festival. We screened your film in the morning, and now we screened it in a big theater, and now we're doing it online. And I think that this hybridity, which kind of defines also the festival, you know, between old traditions and, you know, new habits, is also a theme that kind of runs through your film, Letter to the Editor, and I hope we can talk about it a little bit. I maybe want to start with something that is very introductory, but your film, the basis of your film is a huge photo archive of New York Times images that you've been accumulating for 40 years, which seems like an insane project, cutting with scissors on a daily basis images from a newspaper and then tagging them. And I want to ask you how this project really emerged, and even more importantly, how have you been able to follow it or follow this pattern so advocately for so many years?
Right. Well, thank you. That's the real answer to that is that it's a big mystery to me as well. But I just would say that as we sit here speaking, you're speaking to the 23-year-old person back in 1980 that started this project, as much as you are to the same person now, 40 some odd years later, who brought the project to the finish line. I suppose there are different parts of me all along the way that were all, but there are like 40 some odd years of selves, you know, whose relationship to the project has evolved and changed over the decades, right? So, I mean, the thing about it, when I first began, this project was a kind of, I call it a hunch. You know, I had this idea that maybe one day I would do something with them. And I also should just say that I'm a collagist by nature. That's one thing I knew about myself at a very young age. I liked surrounding myself with things, objects, pictures, but also I'm someone who likes to put things together. So I surround myself with things to put together. So the idea of cutting photographs out of the newspaper, or magazines for that matter, or anywhere in life, that seemed normal to me. But nonetheless, it started out as a hunch. Let's do this. I don't know where it's going to lead. And over the first couple of years, that hunch became a vague idea. You know, but you know, I'm committed to it. Then the idea of cutting out photographs from the newspaper became a kind of routine, a daily routine. That's just what I do. I read the paper and I cut photographs out, you know? Then the routine became a kind of ritual, which means it not only had the routine part, but it became part of my psyche in a way to do that. You know, the day wasn't complete until I did that in some way. Then I suppose in the middle, like 20 years into it, it became, I don't know, like I realized that I was working on a project, you know, didn't have a finish, but it's a project. It's a project, and there's sort of, it's growing. And then over time, you know, within the next 10 years following that, it became an obsession. It became an obsession. I had to do it. And yeah, and
Right.
and then finally in like 7, 8 years ago, when I realized that I was at a stage in life where I'm thinking about time and change and technology. I've always been a news junkie, so it's part of it. Then, you know, then it became like a mission. To finish the film became a mission, particularly in 2016 with the election in the United States and the change of all this issues of fake news. And it just became, and also obviously in the last 10 years or so, with newspapers going out of business and the threat of losing the newspaper as a source of news and technological change, social media, television, and
you just knew the time is right. You had
I felt that the time was right. I felt that the time is right, exactly. And of course, the former president that we used to have was attacking the New York Times all the time, you know, so this sort of was a confluence of a lot of things. But, you know, the thing, I'm sorry, that's a long answer and I apologize, but
no, of course.
There was a sense, you know, listen, I had many ups and downs, the death of my father, September 11th. I mean, life is always, you know, but I managed to kind of stay dedicated to this original hunch. And to, even if I couldn't cut the photographs out every day and a month or two piled up, I piled it up and I did it. I'd spend a week, months later doing it, but I never let go of the project, you know?
It's interesting, you know, start from a hunch and then you call it a habit, an obsession. And I'm thinking while watching your film, you know, the personal aspect of your fear that the New York Times will one day disappear, because it's, you know, its imminent death is related also maybe to a personal anxiety that you may have of losing control of your old habits, right? Because cutting and tagging images from the newspaper suddenly disappears and then it leaves you with time. Right. Extra time, what will you do with it? Right. It's like going, you know, on retirement a little bit.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because the fact that I waited 40 years later to make the film means that the project coincided not only with enormous changes in technology that threatened the newspaper, right? But it coincided with with kind of, you know, sense of mortality, a sense of growing old, my resistance to change, you know, and just this sense of time passing. I mean, that's what the newspaper is. It's a time machine, you know, and so it kind of it coincided with all those things and became, in a way, a kind of lament, you know, and a way of dealing with the end of an era and coping with change as I grow old, you know, and so you know, maybe I didn't know that when I was 23, when I had that hunch, you know, but it gave it a shape for me. It gave the entire experience a shape, you know, because 40 years of life, you go through a lot of changes and a lot of things happen. And but that was always a constant. And I just would say one more thing, that, you know, I've made a lot of personal films in that time period. Portraits of my grandfather, my father, my cousin, film about my name, insomnia, all of these very personal stories.
Yeah.
But in the background, and I never even told anyone I was doing it,
Yeah.
you know, in the background, I was still staying very, very attentive, very, very connected to the world, you know, to the moments, to the stories of the world. And
Yeah.
yeah.
That's really interesting that you're saying it, because I was about to ask you about this tension between the personal and the universal, or the public, in your film. I mean, this is a tension that any diarist, you know, in documentary faces. The challenge of creating your personal story interesting and appealing to a general public. Why is my story interesting? And perhaps you're facing this challenge in your films, making, you know, nobody's business into, in a way, everybody's business. But here, as you said yourself, you have a film that deals with the universal, or the historical memory of the world. It's a little bit like the opposite side of the things. Is it the same thing, really, just from the opposite?
Well, I think that I think it can be both, right, in a way, but it's very much still the same thing. I mean, you want what artists take the world apart and put it back together. You know, that's
Right.
what artists do. But they put it together anew, in a new way, you know, to try to find new meanings, to try to make new metaphors, to create new ways of seeing things and new ways of decoding the world. And I'd like to say, you know, I made a film about insomnia. It's my story, but I wanted to change the way people thought of sleep, or their inability to sleep, or to understand how the world and the chaos of the world, you know, affects the way we process
Right.
our thinking and how it affects our sleep. But, you know, in this film, I took the world apart. I mean, quite literally, the news is the world. It's the daily story of the world. And I tried to change the way people looked at both the world and the news, and the newspaper as the vehicle for how we receive the news, and what's going to be lost when as the newspaper fades out, you know, fades to black, and what the implications are for how we will exist in the world. But, you know, I tried to do so in a world. But let me put it to you this way: this film is different in to the extent that when I said that the film became a mission at the end, you know, I started to think about my role and my responsibility as an artist in the world. What am I here? What am I here to do? What's, you know, and that is, artists transform things. You know, I'm, you know, it used to be the key words for me to explain my films is I try to make the personal universal. You know, not everyone is a parent, but everyone is someone's child. So you know the experience of being in a family. You know, not every family is different, but families are very complicated systems, you know? And so with this film, everyone lives in the barrage. Everyone exists in the storm of news that comes at us every day, good, bad, or otherwise. And, you know, everyone has to, this film was my way of making sense of the world, of decoding the world, of taking it apart. I analyzed it, you know, in my computer. I had more than 1,600 different categories for how to understand the world, for coding the world. And by doing that, it allowed me to almost, if you see all these drawers here, imagine, you know, I had 2,000 drawers with images in every drawer, and that's more or less what I had, you
Wow.
know. And I took it apart, how am I going to put it back together and do so in a way that makes something that changes the way you think about the news, how you think about the world, how you think about time passing, how you understand history, and also maybe the possibility for making something beautiful or transcendent out of the chaos, you know? And so it feels like the same thing. And to do so in a way that's personal, that's from my experience, you know, that's, you know, I'm not a journalist, you know, journalists have jobs, right?
Right.
I don't have a job, I have a role, I have a responsibility. And I take that very seriously. And this film, you know, maybe I waited 4 decades to make the film so I could grow into the person, you know, who could accept the gravity of that responsibility and of that role to do something with all this stuff. You know, wasn't, yeah, I had to be old enough and mature enough and wise enough and crazy enough, frankly, to be able to do that.
Well, I want to ask you two things about what you said. One is the idea of responsibility, because that is a question that I think is part of your film. I mean, it raises that question. What should one do with images?
Yeah.
And you're saying that you felt the more you accumulated more images, that you had sort of a ethical or, I don't know, political, moral responsibility to do something with those images, to decode with them the world in a way. It was kind of you were on a mission.
I was. You know, there's a lot of different ways to answer that question.
Right.
First of all, you know, it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to wake up every morning and read the newspaper over breakfast. There are many people in the world who cannot do that, don't have the luxury of that. That's a privilege. And so there I am. And by the way, I'm just going to digress for a second. For the last 6 or so years of making the film, I bought 2 copies of the newspaper every day.
Oh, it
2.
wasn't 1 copy, it was 2. Wow.
Yeah, I bought 2, and I'll explain why, because it has to do with time passing. And I'm still going to answer your question, but bear with me for a second.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Please digress.
Yeah, in the old days, when I was just cutting newspapers out and you know, letting the piles accumulate, and then I would file them in my studio in boxes, big boxes. If there was a photograph on page 6 that I liked, but also one on the other side, page 7, that I also sort of liked, you know, I chose. Which one do you like more? You know, I didn't like that to have to make that decision, but I would choose, and then that's it. You know, tough, as my father would say, tough. Uh-huh. So at a certain point, when I realized that I really did need to, if you'll excuse me, to land the plane, that I was actually going to finish the film, I realized that's a luxury I can't, that's not a luxury, is not the right word. That's a limitation I can no longer accept. So every day I bought 2 papers because if there was something on page 6 and something on page 7, I wanted access to both. Also, it became an insurance policy, because what if the paper that I was crinkled, you know, or, you know, and in some cases, and I show it in the film, it just so happens that there might be a bad print,
yeah,
you know, in one paper of a photograph, a misprint or something like this. And then another photograph, another newspaper that's printed in a different place or bought at another newsstand is perfect, you know, is better quality, and so forth.
I would just say that, you know, it's, I don't know if you meant that, but it's implicit in your film. When you talk about ghost images,
yeah,
I mean, a viewer thinks about this challenge. He probably needed to have 2 papers.
Right. So, you know, that became, and by the way, I have to say, back to my love of cinema, a second digression, if I may.
Sure.
Back to my love of cinema, because I've been thinking a lot about my love of cinema, and the work that I'm doing now, these sculptural things, is very much involved in that and concerned with that. But you know, now the photographs we see online, the digitized digital photographs, they're crisp and clean and sharp, and they take your breath away. They're so powerful, you know? But the photographs in the newspaper are grainy, you know, on the newsprint texture, they're grainy, and there's a color palette, like they're like filmic, you know, they're not sharp. They're slightly impressionistic, even side by side for sure. And so in a way, my love of the newspaper photograph on newsprint, you know, is a kind of harkening back to my love of cinema, to the grainy, not quite fuzzy, but grainy images, as opposed to the digital technology, you know, that we're now.
That's interesting. I mean, can we add to this fetishism? I mean, I think fetishism is something, in lack of a better term, that runs through your film. I mean, the love of the newspaper, the need to hold it, the need to flick through its pages,
Yeah.
and or also the in praise of the imperfect image, in a way, is also part of it. And I'm wondering, is this, maybe this is a tough question, but is this related somehow also to the fear of forgetting, of losing memory? Because the notion of not being able to touch something anymore is also a fear of it, you know, slipping away, disappear into oblivion.
Yeah. I don't think there's any question. I mean, that issue of mortality is personal, and it's technological, and it's cultural. I mean, the newspaper is dying too, you know?
Right.
So, of course, the tactility, which is something, you know, when I used to make 16 millimeter films on motion picture film, that's a tactile experience, you know? That's how I learned to tell stories. That's how I understood myself as a creative being, is through handling of things, through touching things, putting things together with my hands. And so cutting the newspapers out, the photographs out over the years. And, you know, this is like one of the big mysteries that I still don't understand, which is, it's one thing reading a newspaper and you see the photograph and you read the article, and usually we glance at the photograph and we read and most of our time is spent, pardon me, reading the article. But in the case of, you know, there is more than 7,000 photographs in the film. In order to make the film, I digitized more than 12,000 photographs, so you know. But the amount of photographs I cut out, I can't even put a number to, because it's over 40 years. I can't count them anymore because it's too many to count, but it would be embarrassing, okay? You say fetishized, I say obsession, but it would be embarrassing. It's so many, okay? But my point is that I spent time with each photograph, you know, with a mat knife and a ruler. I looked at it, okay? Then I would put it on the side, and then later on, I would come back to it to file it, you know? So what does that do to someone who's having all this extra time with these photographs, one at a time, in both the cutting and the filing, you know? That's even before I'm editing in the software to make a film. I had spent a lot of time with each one, some of which are horrific, you know, and represent horrible things going on in the world, and so forth. And, you know, what does that do to someone? I don't know. But in many ways, I created a personal relationship to many of the photographs that, you know, on an ongoing basis was, you know, I had favorite photographs. I had photographs that reminded me of family and friends. I mean, but, you know, and then what happens when you have a box with 1,000 photographs of, you know, children holding guns? What do you do with that? But, you know, when you look through, wow, after 40 years, I have 1,000 photographs of children holding guns. You know, not one, not two, not three. I mean, the impact on the psyche, what the impact, and that's just one subject, one category, you know, what that does to you, what that did to me, I don't know.
Is
But
it, is it a little bit like big data? I mean, what we talk about when we speak about big data in the digital world, the fact that you can make patterns, understand patterns about the world from a lot of information, a lot of data, like the dichotomy between good news and bad news that you make in your film. I mean, this
Yeah,
is a very powerful tool that you have in your hand.
yeah. Well, like I say, I have the world in my hands, literally. I have the whole world.
Yeah.
The newspaper. I mean, I don't know anyone who really reads the entire newspaper from first word top left to last word
You do.
bottom right. Yeah, no, I'm talking about of the whole newspaper. I mean, every section. First of all, that would take hours.
Mhm.
So people have their own unique ways of reading the newspaper, right? But I might not have obviously been reading every article every day, but I was turning the pages of every page of the newspaper, reading articles, but also look. And actually, the way I would do it is I read the newspaper the first thing every morning in my way. And then later in the afternoon, when I go to my studio, I would read it again, so to speak, with an emphasis on which photographs from that day are going to become part of my selects. What am I, so I'm editing from the beginning, from the very beginning. There's a kind of pre-editing going on, But also, another interesting thing, I mentioned children with guns. Part of being a citizen of the world in this way and a collagist is I used to, in the old days when I first started, I would have a category called men with guns, and it seemed like it's a large general category, and it seemed sufficient for the quantity of images that I found with men with guns. At a certain point, I realized that I was finding more and more images of women with guns. Like I didn't see that for a long time. They weren't, and so I created another category called women with guns. So suddenly I had to make this separation of, and then after another decade or years, I started realizing, there are more and more images of children with guns. So that became a third category, and that's that's the world is changing, right? Because there are more instances out there where there are more and more people with guns motivated to have them or in positions where they needed them, what have you. But so I'm mirroring the world, I'm responding to the world. And so I'm changing the categories and part of the process of making this film was not only collecting the images, but I had to adjust the categories, how I saw the world when I began to file them. And every couple of years, I would go through a kind of purging and a recreation of my system of codification and cataloging based on how the world was changing through the photographs in the newspaper and how I understood it, how I made sense of it. And that was always a very engaging thing. I knew every time I would do a sorting of photographs that had piled up. It made sense to let several thousand accumulate before I would
Right.
sort them and catalog them. Every time I did that, I would have to make new categories, change them, even the wording of some categories. I changed the wording or I let a category go because now it's something I see it differently, and that's process. It's an ongoing process.
So when you say categories, also you mean tagging them, right? After you scan an image, you tag them on your computer, or you actually mean categories as in putting the photographs on a pile that is separate from the other piles?
Well, it's now we're in old technology, new technology,
Exactly.
analog and digital. Every photograph that I had for like 30 years went in a box, with a category. And I had 500-600 categories of boxes. That's a lot of shelf space,
Uh-huh.
But when you're in the digital world, okay, in the digital universe, every photograph had I don't know what you call them, buzzwords, keywords, whatever. In fact, I say it in, if anyone who sees the film, there's an image of an ambassador, an ambassador at the United Nations who's writing in a
Yeah.
crossword puzzle
Yeah.
Yeah, and you see he's from Iraq and so forth. And literally, I go through the list of he's ambassador, Iraq, writing, eyes looking down, crossword puzzle, whatever. That's the all those words with the name of that photograph. All those words with the name of that photograph. And that photograph on my computer got put in, if there were 12 categories, it was put in 12 categories. You understand? I filed in 12 different folders,
Okay.
right? And the interesting thing about that is, you know, that's in eyes looking down. He's wearing a watch. It's in time. But there are many other images that have nothing to do with an ambassador at the United Nations that are also in clock and time. So it creates, when I looked at the folders, having sorted everything out, there are a lot of very strange and different images in the same folder that have nothing to do with one another except for that one criteria that, you know, suddenly start in my mind, start I'm making connections between things that I never would have. The digital process allows for those kind of connections to be made.
So you're kind of you're bringing the digital tagging into the physical analog
That's
world.
correct. That's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to speak to you a little bit about sound, also in this respect of boxes and tagging, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have a feeling that this film could be paired nicely with Wide Awake from 2006, where you're sharing with viewers, of course, your insomnia, but also they're similar because in both you show us your collection.
Yeah.
And in your studio, the collection, here's the collection of newspaper images, but there it's a drawer upon drawer of sound clips that you are about to use ready to use in future films. So this film is about image. The previous film, Wide Awake, is really about sound. Do you see them as related as well? You know,
absolutely, absolutely. It gets, again, it comes back to this, you know, I'm someone who likes to put things together. I'm a collagist, and I need to take things apart to put them back together. I'm wired. That's how I'm wired, you know. And so, and the process of doing that allows me to make new combinations and unexpected and unpredictable juxtapositions between things, which allows me hopefully to create new meanings and see new possibilities for metaphors. And in the end, it allows the audience to, I hope, gives the audience the possibility for seeing the world or seeing those things, listening, seeing and listening together in ways that they never have before, you know, that are outside of a kind of predictable experience. But it's all the same for me. I also, I'm someone for whom sound and image, as a filmmaker, they've always been equal to me. You know, I don't, for many filmmakers, sound is something after the fact. We'll do it at the mix, or we'll, you know, it's secondary. It's like the second child in the family is
child of cinema.
Yeah. And I've never, you know, I've had ideas. I can have an idea for a film, or to do something that's generated from a sound as easily as I can from a sound idea, than would be from just a picture idea. They're equal, you know, and that's been something that's been true from the very beginning of my work, and remains to this day. So,
and I would
and needless to say, there were many categories of images that you know, had to do with sound. You know, if there was a sound somehow embedded in the image or hidden in the image. I even, in part of Letter to the Editor, much of the music I use comes from the images.
Right.
You know, someone's holding an album of a band, you know, I use that music. Someone's playing a record, that I use that music. You know, so it's all connected. It's all connected.
There's a sense in which sound in your film is not only kind of guiding the rhythm or the pace of the film, and even creating, I would say, a specific emotional effect, but it's also, you know, you have a very distinguished soundscape in your film. You have typical sound types, like the typewriter in Intimate Stranger, or Our First Cousin Once Removed, or the bell of the ring in Nobody's Business. And here, I believe it would be fair to say the scream. Can you talk about this a little bit, about the
Yeah, yeah,
signature sounds?
yeah. I get to the scream and I want to talk about the scream. That's a very interesting thing. But I just want to say, even like in Letter to the Editor, there's a thread of sound from a sewing machine. Yeah, a sewing machine. It's happened 3 or 4 times. And no big deal. But, you know, I'm the grandson of a tailor. Yeah. And so the sound of a sewing machine, which was the sound of my grandfather, who I never met, and to be honest with you, but that was a really important sound in his life. And so for me, the sound of a sewing machine is a very personal sound, you know, because I often feel like I'm a tailor too, cutting picture and sound together. And in the old days when I was making films, I had strips of 16mm film around my neck and, you know, measuring. I'm a tailor, you know, I just sew. I don't use needle and thread. I use sound and image and computers, you know. I mean, anyway, so that's like a personal sound. So every time I use a sewing machine in a film, that's like a way of evoking my grandfather and my connection to my grandfather, you know. But okay, the screams. I'm going to be very upfront. There are a lot of them in the film, and what can I say? Most people I know and people who I trust and who I show my film to for feedback told me that there were way too many. And this is one case in the process of making a film in which I ignored everyone's suggestion. To me, the scream is arguably the most important sound in the film. And of course, the scream, a scream, is the most emotional part of sound in life. And so, and it has so many different meanings, and I tried to activate those meanings. So a scream is a scream of anger, right? A scream of protest, right. But it's also a scream of joy, right? It's the sound we make when we win, but it's also the sound we make when we lose. And it's a sound of frustration. And it's the sound of facing mortality, you know, but guess what? And death. But guess what? It's also the sound of childbirth, both of the baby and the mother, you know? And so it's pain and joy. It's in that scream is the full spectrum of emotional power, emotional life in the world. And so it was important to me to give it its full spectrum, you know. And I know it's loud and it's jarring, but that's life. And that's one of the things, you know, the 23-year-old who began the project had no idea that the scream would be such an important metaphor and sound and have the gravitas that it has. But the 63-year-old in me who made the film, that was one of the insights I took away, you know, from the film. So I apologize to those who think there are too many and they're too loud and all that stuff. But I had to do it. I had to do it. And yeah, I stand by it.
Personally, I don't think it's too many. I think it works just fine. And we talked about pace, and we have a question here from Chava, who is asking, why were some of the sequences so fast? Because it made me feel that I missed some of the pictures. And part of me want to answer that question. It is usually the case with essay films that you need to watch it again and again, and you miss so many things in it. But do you consider your films being fast, or this film?
This film is especially fast. It's fast. I would like to say that it's fast on purpose. All right. First of all, the news is a barrage, right, of information and facts and opinions and history. And I mean, it's, again, the newspaper, every day's news is a barrage. Film is linear. And so I wanted to express that overwhelming chaos that comes at us each day. Of course, I have 40 years worth of overwhelming chaos. That's 40 times 365 days of overwhelming chaos, you know? But, you know, the rhythm of the images over the sewing machine, you know, that's how fast they needed to be to be sewn together, you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not the individual image, it's the metaphor of that there are so many of them, you know, that's what it's about. In the case, like in, for argument's sake, in the sports section, and remember, every newspaper has a sports section. The idea that I could animate, and I use that word in quotation marks, a pitcher in the sport of baseball winding up and throwing the ball, and a batter seeing the ball and then swinging the bat, you know, in order to make that happen, the images have to, you know, that's a reference to motion picture, to the roots of motion picture, the persistence of vision, you know, the roots of cinema. And so they have to be that fast.
Right.
So, you know, listen, the film is also, in the digital age, any film is a kind of microfilm, you know, it can be looked at again and again, and it can be studied and it can be stopped upon, you know. So, and, you know, I had the same problem. I made a film about my grandfather called Intimate Stranger 30 some odd years ago. And the film is told, as it were, the film has the the rat-a-tat-tat of a typewriter, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And every image is on for as long as it takes, for, you know, every typewriter click. And I had people say the images go by so quickly, you know, I can't see. It's on for 3 frames, an eighth of a second, what, and then half a second, you know, and it's too fast. And I can only say the same thing now that I said then, which is the speed at which the image occurs is a metaphor unto itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not only about the images themselves. And I sometimes think, I used to say, and I'll still say, that the speed of every image, it's almost like in a portrait or in a statue. It's each image, however long it's on, is like a chisel hit, you know, like a, you know, to make the story, to make the portrait, in this case of the newspaper or of news. So there are supposed to be a lot of images because there are a lot of images in the world. That's what the newspaper contains. And that's the chaos, the barrage of chaos. And it was my role, job, responsibility to transform all of that. And yeah, and if it makes you want to watch the film again, that's good.
Speaking about speed and the speed of images, I'm being signaled that we have 2 more minutes left, and I wanted to,
okay.
It's a shame because I wanted also to ask you about humor and Jewishness and Jewish humor, but I want to take another question from the audience.
Okay.
Someone is asking, he says, we loved watching the film in a real cinema this morning. As I told you, there was a screening this morning. And that's an interesting question. Do you have similar feelings, and I would say maybe even anxieties about the death of cinema as you have for print paper?
Absolutely. I mean, it comes back to what I'm doing now, you know.
The sculpture project.
The sculpture project, exactly. It's all connected. It's, you know, I'm now old enough to understand how I resist change and how I'm connected to, you know, ways of doing things and ways of thinking about things, cinema, the newspaper. And I'm, you know, afraid about how the acceleration of new technologies have changed how the world and how we look at the world, and how, and you can see there's things happening in politics and in around the world due to acceleration in technology that are frightening, you know. And so, yeah, I'm holding on to my love of things that I can hold, that I can touch. You know, I have a 17-year-old son. I had to show him what a manual typewriter was because he wouldn't know otherwise, you know. I had to show him play him a rotary telephone and what a beautiful sound it makes when you turn the dials, because he wouldn't know, you know. And you know, it's through these things that I've learned how to be a creative being in the world, and it's how I understand the world. And they're becoming lost and they're fading out, and it makes me sad. You know, I'm dealing with it, but you know, I'm more than a little frightened, you know, and but it's the same thing. It's the same thing. As much as these are films that are about my fear of what will happen or what's happening, they're also about my love of a world that I grew up in, and I learned how to grow and thrive in, you know. So same thing, same thing.
It's interesting that this question about the death of cinema brought us again to your sculpture project that's kind of bookended our conversation.
Yeah.
I am thrilled to watch it, and I will be so happy if we can make it again in Docaviv or elsewhere soon. And I'm thanking you so much, Alan, for this wonderful conversation, and thanks everyone for watching us.
Thank you, Ohad. I appreciate it very much. Great to talk to you, to meet you, and see you in Tel Aviv one day. Okay?
Sure.
Okay. Be well.
You
Thank
too.
you so much. Ciao. Shalom. Shalom.
Bye.